morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. In honor of
Good morning,
National Foster
everybody.
Care,
Thank you so much for joining us today.
in honor of National Foster Care Awareness Month. TWC is proud to launch our weekly webinar series focused on improving the lives of youth impacted by foster care and educating those who support them. This series serves as an important prelude to our TWC annual Foster Youth Conference, which is scheduled for July 13th through the 15th of 2026 at the Marriott Dallas Hotel and Convention Center in Allen, Texas. So I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. Attendees who hold a CRC can earn one CEU per session by completing the survey that will be posted toward the end of this 1 hour webinar. Those who hold licenses outside of a CRC can take the CEUs to their board to see if it meets their board criteria. This webinar will be recorded, but you must attend live to receive CRC CEUs. The recordings will be posted on our TWC website that I'll also share in the chat shortly. We'll answer as many questions as possible during the webinar. Dr. Karyn Harvey has also offered her email should we run out of time to answer all the questions. We have ASL interpreters and closed captioning available for attendees, and a companion document in Word will be shared for participants who need that accommodation. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce you to Dr. Karyn Harvey. Dr. Harvey has over 35 years experience working with individuals who have intellectual disabilities. She's written several books and received several awards for her work. Today, she's going to speak on the topic of post-traumatic growth for foster care alumni. At the end of this webinar, I will share a link with you in the chat box so that you can earn your CEU. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Karyn Harvey.
Hi there. Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be kicking off this important series. And I love doing anything for TWC. So great. And you do such wonderful support so many people. Honor. So I start off with my most important message of the day. And that message is to all of you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for the work you do. Thank you to those who are actual foster carers. Oh my goodness. Thank you for those supporting the supporters. This is tough work. And thank you. There's a Buddhist from Shonen in the 13th century, and he says, unseen virtue brings visible reward. And I know everybody here, everybody in this wonderful Zoom room, you all have so much unseen virtue, so much that you do that nobody else knows about, right? I bet we can just look at the last month and name 10 things you've all done, like phone calls you made, places you went to check on folks, system things that you fixed or you adjusted, right? The list is so long. Thank you. Thank you for all of your unseen virtue. This is my most important message. Thank you for what you do. It's so wonderful. Now, the visible reward, I can't really guarantee that. I wish I were Oprah and I'd say there's a check in the mail for everybody, but I'm not. But you have great karma, right? And what goes around comes around. But thank you, thank you, thank you. And the other thing is you're going to have to take time for yourself. So I know in my experience of working with many people in many organizations and then speaking in many places, the best of people, the givers, caring ones, the people who give extra, often don't care of themselves, right? And you've got to stop and refill your bucket. You've got to stop and say, wait a minute, I need a minute for me, more than a minute, right? So I would like everybody to take a minute and think of something that you love to do that is just for you. Okay, is everybody thinking? You can jot it down. I'm jotting down Netflix and Chardonnay. I mean, it's okay if it involves a little alcohol. Whatever it is, no judgment. Okay. And I used to say Netflix and chill, but then somebody told me not to say that because that's not what's happening. But Netflix, that's me. Maybe it's taking a walk, maybe it's gardening, maybe it's cooking. Write your thing down. And then I have a big ask for all of you. Do it more. Take care of yourself. We're just talking earlier about secondary trauma. When you're working with children who have a lot of trauma, when you're supporting kids who have been through so much and those kiddos are having issues, it affects you. Even supporting the supporters can affect you. So we have to take extra care of ourselves when we do this work. We have to address that. Unfortunately, there usually isn't anyone waiting in the wings saying, wow, you've given so much today. You work so hard. You need time for yourself. Yeah, there's usually more people needing you, right? There's kids or there's parents or there's both. But please take that time for you. I can't emphasize enough how critical that is. Um, that self-care, which is maybe an overused term, but so important. I used to tell everyone to do yoga, but I don't do it because it looks like it hurts. You do you, whatever your thing is. Thank you. So now we'll talk about some stuff and then talk about the trauma. Everyone to keep in mind the fact that there's a beautiful concept called plasticity that we talked about earlier that down the brain gets with the trauma, no matter what goes through, a person's head and heart, and how much a child can be suffering to be nurtured, to be get, and the work you do is so critical. And we talk about damage. I'm going to talk about some of the effects of trauma, but we're also going to talk about healing because with the nurturing that so many of you give, people do heal. Children heal, adults heal, and post-traumatic growth occurs, and that's the growth after trauma. So let's look at the trauma first. Okay, there's some research showing us that people with intellectual disabilities, which is what I'm focusing on today, intellectual and developmental disabilities, children in particular with these disabilities are actually more vulnerable to trauma than people without. So this is a important research that was done by McNally because for years I've been told by people, well, folks with intellectual disabilities are not as affected. Actually, it's the opposite. They're more effective. And I've always believed that. And I've seen that in my work as a therapist. And I've done therapy for 35 years with folks with disabilities. And I see that all the time. And now the research is supporting it. Julie Gentile says that post-traumatic stress disorder is often the real core of somebody's mental health issue, but it's missed. And people are misdiagnosed. Sometimes they're labeled as bipolar, schizophrenic, so many things, personality disorders, you name them, right? When the symptoms really boil down to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll look at some of them today. Kiesler talks about trauma and PTSD being underdiagnosed in children and adults with disabilities. Well, sources of trauma. Unfortunately, there's so many. Unfortunately, there is a lot of sexual abuse in this world. It is tough, and there's a much higher rate. Children are 7 times with intellectual and developmental disabilities, 7 times more likely at some point in their lives to be sexually abused than children and adults without. Physical abuse, bullying, the effects of bullying are devastating. For years, we didn't really study that or look at that, and now there's so much research showing us that any kind of bullying has serious repercussions and children suffer. And unfortunately, right, we're in a world where children can be cruel. And there's also exclusion. Being excluded can cause physical pain. That's what we've learned from research done by Dr. Eisenberger. She showed how exclusion, bullying, all these things really cause physical pain and then ongoing damage and institutionalization as well. It's very important that we look at the trauma of the system. So I've been able to be privileged to be involved in cases and supporting families where children were completely traumatized by restraints that were used. And this is a harsh reality in our school systems in special education. Only 17 states actually even track the use of restraints, and they are often ongoing and very damaging to the children in many cases. So here's a report that I found that's a little bit upsetting, but these are realities that we should look at, and the trauma that children have when they come into our system, right? Or continuing to be in the system, no matter how much support they're getting at home.
In North Carolina, students with mental illness were being taped to chairs and locked in closets by teachers. In Washington State, a middle school student was restrained by pressing her face into a carpet for an extended period of time. In South Dakota, a young boy was secluded in a storage room. It caused him to develop anxiety about going to school. In West Virginia, a teen was restrained by a school staff with no special training. His injuries were so severe, his physician called Child Protective Services to report child abuse. In Florida, a middle school student was physically restrained on a daily basis for 2 years, resulting in post-traumatic stress disorder. Every child has the right to feel safe and included at school, but across the U.S., many students with disabilities have experiences that are exactly the opposite. Restraints are any holds in which a student's ability to move is limited. A prone restraint is one method in which two adults hold down a child's legs and arms while the child is forced face down on the floor. Sometimes restraints involve using tools like straps, handcuffs, or bungee cords. Seclusion is more than just a timeout. Students are left isolated and confined for excessive periods of time, sometimes without contact or observation from anyone. These controversial methods are intended to prevent a student from harming themselves or others, but instead, they cause greater harm, even death. And too often, school staff use restraint and seclusion as a first step in any behavior situation, not as a last resort. According to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, states reported 122,000 incidents of restraint and seclusion in the 2015-16 school year, and that estimate is probably low. 71% of those restrained and 66% of those secluded were students with disabilities. Federal statutes regulate restraint and seclusion in prisons, hospitals, nursing homes, and psychiatric facilities, but not in schools. And all previous attempts for federal regulation have failed. And in many states, there are very few, often vague laws. Schools are supposed to help kids get ready for the future, not burden them with lifelong trauma. We need to educate school staff on how and why students with learning and behavioral issues may react the way they do. Schools need to implement comprehensive research-based mental and behavioral services in schools. Schools need to have detailed de-escalation training in place for teachers, staff, and school. We also need a national standard of positive interventions and supports. Restraint and seclusion represent a failure to support students.
In Arkansas, contact Disability Rights Arkansas at disabilityrightsar.org or by calling 800-482-1174.
This is a harsh reality. And it's important for us to acknowledge that many children are being traumatized in the school systems. And many of the behavioral interventions do go immediately to restraints or seclusion. I've worked with a number of children who have been traumatized by that. I worked with several people who stopped talking, became selectively mute, people who had children who had horrible phobias of school and refused to go to school after being restrained. So these realities are going on. There's the big T trauma, right, of this kind of treatment, and the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, but then those little small traumas of being neglected, being excluded, being rejected, they add up as well. The frequent foster care placements. When every time a child fills out of a foster care placement, that is its own unique trauma, right? That's a tough situation of rejection. Maybe that's not what happened, but it can be perceived by the child that way. So there's so many sources of trauma that children experience, and we can assume trauma. We can assume when a child's in the foster care system and when a child has an intellectual or developmental disability, that trauma is there. So we have to work with them in the most trauma-informed way possible. That means giving extra support. Sometimes we've been taught in the past that we have to totally focus on the behavior and controlling the behavior. Well, when the behavior is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, we can actually re-traumatize children and also create a sense of shame. I'm a bad person. I have these bad behaviors. When these behaviors are symptoms, they're in a hyper aroused state because they've been triggered. They're freaking out. They're not feeling safe. And then they're shamed for whatever they did in that state. When what they need is to be accepted, supported, encouraged, and respected so they can grow, so they can move past their trauma rather than be re-traumatized. We know this, yet sometimes the system does the opposite. Well-meaning people doing what they believe is right. And I think we need to shift the paradigm. And if we have a trauma-informed paradigm, then we can recognize trauma is there. Just having a disability is trauma. And there's no child that isn't bullied who has a disability at some point in their life. So how can we nurture? How can we support? An important study was done looking at the effects of neglect. And I know many of you work with children who've been neglected, right? Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm just going to tell you the study. Here's the results, but let me describe it first. That neglect causes serious trauma. So there was an important study done by Nathan Fox. He went to an orphanage in Romania. Probably some of you know this study. And it's called the Bucharest Early Intervention Study. And he took the children in this very poor orphanage. He took half of them and he put them in a very nurturing foster care system where they received lots of support and love. They actually made sure that at least one parent stayed home, and they trained those parents in being very nurturing and very caring and really extra love and support. And then they left half the children, so randomly picked them. Half the children were left in the institution, in the orphanage, where they got very little care because there were so many kids and so few staff, right? Just after a very short time, 4.5 years, and let me tell you, these children were between 6 months old and 4.5. And you would say, if knowing what we know about development, right, that the damage is already done when you're looking at a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 4.5-year-old. Oh, that's, the first 5 years are everything, even 6 months and a year or 2 years, the damage is done. And yet those children received the nurturing in those settings, did so well, did amazingly well. And so here's the results, the difference. And this is in a very short period of time, right? 4.5 years, not much. The children left in the institution, 55% had some kind of serious mental health issue. And that went down by 20%. Only 35% in the foster care setting had that. The biological families, they were, that's just the control group of the kids that were raised at home. So 49% had emotional disorders, 20% left again. 29%, 20 points lower, sorry. 29% only had emotional disorders. 32% had serious behavioral issues, and 25% in the foster care setting. So there's less of a difference there because a lot of children shut down and withdraw, dissociate, right? And you see that. Um, Interesting statistic for those of us working in the disability world, the average IQ of those children left in the orphanage was 73, almost half qualified as having an intellectual disability, whereas there was a 12-point increase in IQ for the children who went into nurturing foster care situations where they were loved and supported and cared for, and they focused on the nurturing, did not focus on what was wrong behaviorally, did not do that as much as giving that emotional support was the emphasis. The children who stayed in the orphanage, their brains actually shrunk. Their brains were smaller, the gray matter, right? I mean, that's unbelievable. Tragically, there were a number of early deaths. You know, back in the day, we used to call that failure to thrive syndrome. And we first saw it in orphanages at the turn of the century in the 1900s, where children were dying in orphanages for no reason. They were healthy because of the lack of love, the lack of caring, the lack of nurturing. That's how critical the nurturing is, and how important that children of all ages get that interaction. That interaction is critical, right? That back and forth, so important. We have something called mirror neurons, or at least we know it's a neuronal function, where if we're a baby and somebody's talking to us, even though we can't talk, our brain is firing as though we're talking. If somebody's smiling and nurturing, the brain is firing as though it's smiling. So a baby can learn to make human connection, emotional connection, um, positive emotion, language, all kinds of things with interaction. But when the neglect is there and they don't get the interaction, it's devastating. The other devastation is traumatic in utero exposure, right? Drugs and alcohol. So we have in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen quite an increase of children born addicted to drugs. When I was working years ago, I was working with transitioning youth, and one youth after another was coming to us with this certain profile. They were smart, they could speak, they could write, maybe at a first or second grade level. They had such severe ADHD that they couldn't finish a sentence, they couldn't finish a task, having so many difficulties, great social awareness, wanted more than anything else not to be seen as having a disability, but so much impulse control would go from 0 to 100 in half a second. And it was a new profile. And the behavior plans that I was writing did not work because people would sabotage the reward right before they were about to earn it. I don't know if this sounds familiar to any of you, right? Just kind of self-sabotage over and over again, right before they were about to earn that reward or make that breakthrough. We started doing lots of therapy with them, and I started looking into the histories, like, what is this new profile? These folks are different. These guys are different. And every single one of the children that were transitioning with us, the youth that came to us, they were all exposed to cocaine in utero. And this was during the tragic crack epidemic, right? Intergenerational trauma. Statistics out of West Virginia University, nearly 2020, nearly 1 in 12 newborns, 1 in 12, or about 300,000 infants were exposed to alcohol, opioids, marijuana, or cocaine before born, right? So there's such a pattern where you see the intelligence that was there, and yet there's very specific brain damage where folks might have an impulse control issue and learning problems and problems often with working memory, accessing working memory as a result of these drug and then alcohol exposures, where we've always seen and understood somewhat about fetal alcohol syndrome, but the patterns of that we see now more clearly, and we understand this when there's alcohol exposure at certain points during the pregnancy, it impairs the brain's ability to connect cause and effect, right? Sequential reasoning is damaged. Our behavior plans are based on an understanding of cause and effect. So we say to people, if you do this, then you're going to get that. But if you don't do this, you won't get your reward or whatever, even as positive as they may be. it can set children who have had that alcohol exposure up for a lot of frustration. What I have often seen in the many years of work I've been doing, particularly in the last 25 years or so, is that alcohol drug combination exposure in utero. We also have less children born with genetic disorders. And here's why. This wonderful guy, Frank Stevens, talks about the fact that it's changed, right? And he has a plea to me that's very important. He's an actor. He was in the movie Champions and Peanut Butter Falcon. Amazing actor. But here he is giving us a plea that I feel is important to show.
All right, everyone rolling, and action.
Okay, all right, Frank, you've grown up in a world that didn't just assume that your life had value. We're going to start just by talking a little bit about what life is really like.
We are trying to live in a society that
So sorry.
wants to prick us with a needle and try and terminate us, but we're trying to tell people, let us live. Doctors, bring an outdated, inaccurate picture of life with people like me. I'm going to tell people, oh, you're going to have a child that's going to be a burden to your family. You're going to have a child that somehow they'll bring misfortune. They have no idea of what we bring to the table. They think that we live a life of unhappiness and suffering, but the thing is, that's not really true. I mean, take a look at the stuff that I've accomplished. I starred in a film, getting ready to do a Broadway play. I have been to the White House twice, and I didn't have to jump the fence either time. I've spoken almost all over the world, like London, Paris, Geneva, Australia. I've done so many things. I feel like I've accomplished a lot. And people that like me, they can accomplish amazing things too. I want to fix the fact that sometimes people don't always look at us with love. People like us don't mean you any harm. All we want to do is live, love, like the rest of you do. So let's help people understand that a life with Down syndrome is just like having a life like yours. And you can see that just by looking at us, looking at our smiles. When you fully get to know us, that's when you can fully learn to love us. Let us fill your life with love, happiness, and joy, because that's what we bring.
Isn't that the truth? We've had so many families come to me after they got a positive amniocentesis for Down syndrome or, spina bifida. There's a number of things we can screen for. And got repeated calls from the doctor's office trying to set up the abortion. One family in North Carolina told me they were called 6 times by the doctor's office. The doctor really wants to set up your abortion. When are you going to do it? And they finally had to threaten to call a lawyer to get the calls to stop. They were like, we want this baby. So we have very different topography in our field of disabilities in working with children. We have a lot of children who have a lot of trauma because not only in many cases were they exposed to substances in utero, we don't even know what the exposure to OxyContin looks like. We're just finding that out, methamphetamines, cocaine, these patterns of severe ADA and impulse control, but yet other parts. And these children are coming to us and coming in the field and needing extra support. And they're born into chaos oftentimes. They're born into homes where there's lots of drug and alcohol abuse, substance abuse. And this is trauma. This is trauma. So we have to understand that a lot of the behavioral issues that we're looking at are about trauma. And I'm not going to go too much into the brain because we don't have a lot of time today, but I think a lot of you already understand. We have that in our yellow part of our brain. We have the fight, flight, and freeze system, right? Where a lot of the behavioral issues that we see are really that effects of trauma because people are go into that fight, flight, and freeze mode because they're triggered, because somebody said something, because they feel threatened, and then maybe they're running out the door or they're attacking someone because the best defense is a good offense, and they're not doing this to get something. They're not doing this just to communicate. They're doing this system is freaking out. They've been triggered. The brain is filled with chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol. They go down through the vagal nervous system and fill the whole body up, and that child is reacting. The smart brain, the neocortex, the rational brain, goes offline when that happens. So I've written behavior plans that were very, very bad. I've made a lot of mistakes because I wrote plans that said, tell them that they'll lose their points, they'll lose their soda, or they'll lose whatever if they throw that chair or punch somebody. And then they're not thinking because their rational brain is offline. They're just freaking out. And then you just said one more thing that triggered them, right? So I set staff up. But so important we understand that many of the behaviors, they're that fight, flight, or freeze, or the fawning. I'm sorry, I love you, I love you. The just attachment. Janina Fisher is a psychologist who talks about the fact that your attachment issues sometimes when triggered, some people become very needy. I need you, and they're clinging. I won't let go. Very ashamed. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Right? So many responses you see as a result of this triggering and this trauma. And what they'll need for their brain to come back online is to know that they're safe, to get away from those triggers, take walk with me, talk with me, get away from the triggers. And when children are restrained in the middle of those responses, it re-traumatizes them very frequently. It's very difficult. And there's a wonderful, I know I'm showing a lot of videos, but to me, it's really important to have the voice of people with disabilities when we're talking about disability, and hear them explain exactly how they've been affected. So there's Jordan Zimmerman was somebody who was looked at, and I love having her voice in whatever I do. She was looked at as somebody who had an IQ below 65, who just wasn't smart, wasn't capable, and she was so frustrated. She has autism and is non-speaking, and so frustrated at no one listening to her, no one hearing her, not being able to communicate. And all she had to communicate were her behavior. And she was completely misunderstood. And the schools, because she had problems, they weren't going to do augmented communication, AAC, no alternative augmented communication, because her behaviors are so bad. So she was using her behavior to communicate. And she wasn't then supported in getting a device that she could use until finally at 18, her parents sued the school and she got access to AAC and to be able to communicate. And her voice is so important because communication is so critical. That will lower the trauma when people can be heard, can be listened to. When we're really listening, they don't have to use their behavior, right? And they can start to feel safe because they've been able to express themselves and because they're able to move on and move forward. Here she is.
My name is Jordan Zimmerman, and I am 27 years old. I communicate via an application on my iPad, by typing letter by letter, which then generates words, and speaks aloud, when I'm ready. I earned my bachelor's degree in education policy from Ohio University, and most recently, I earned my master's of education from Boston College. I currently work at a nonprofit as the director of professional development. It's difficult to explain the intense emotions of what it was like before I had effective communication. I was really unhappy. I was restrained on a daily basis for years. The teachers would set timers, get off of me when the law mandated it, and then resume restraining me. I repeatedly went home with bruises and other injuries, but was unable to share about the trauma I was enduring. My family has been very supportive, especially my mom. She was a fierce fighter for my needs.
Okay.
I was inside of you.
Yes. And that's her big brother Andrew. He was 3.
At the same time, she was repeatedly told that I would not be successful with AAC at the time. There was such a focus on my behaviors, that it was almost a prerequisite in a way, which just shouldn't be. The process of obtaining an effective system of communication was excruciating. It took days and months of advocating from my parents and attorneys, against a school system that failed to see my potential, and frustration that was internally stuck inside of me. I surprised everyone when I started typing. I drew and colored all 4 of those squares, they all have my initials hidden. I was 18 years old and every day was an extreme challenge. The school did not take well to my form of advocacy. I was in and out of the local public high school, and had a few segregated placements at schools aimed towards the instruction of autistic students. I experienced long hours of pointing to my nose, repetitively completing addition and subtraction problems which I had done for years before, listening to people speak about the troubles I caused, and there were other times where I was not at the public school, because the district said they could not serve me. Regardless of where I was, the academic content that one would expect at each level was essentially non-existent. I have most definitely felt underestimated because of the way I communicate. I often think of the educational reports that were written about me. I was listening the whole time, and they broke me internally, in pieces. When I was in middle school, I vividly remember hearing about my IQ test that was in the 60s. I don't know why that sticks out so much, and I now believe these tests are a terrible measure. My experience in college has been amazing and significantly challenging at the same time. College was the first time I was ever on my own. I lived on campus all 4 years of undergrad, ate at the dining halls, started an inclusive cheerleading team, and naturally learned new skills. However, there is also some bad and ugly. I was constantly assumed to be deaf, asked if I was really a student on campus, and how I could live there. People are impatient and language moves fast. I hit the wrong buttons and forget where phrases are. But worst of all, I am automatically presumed to be incapable of tasks I am attempting to accomplish. Ableism is a real challenge. Yeah, that was fun. I also like that because while the audience is obviously people dedicated to improving the lives of people with disabilities. I have 2 broad tips for people without communication disabilities who want to be better allies. Everyone has language, and a story to be told. My behaviors became the only language I knew, biting and spitting when I didn't want something, and running when I was overstimulated with my inner dialogue. Every person has language and every person has experiences, which prompts them to want to make a difference. The problem is that when others don't acknowledge our language, we may not realize our potential to create change. Presume competence. Unfortunately, systems are focused on deficits rather than strengths. This commonly sets people up for failure, as everything is based on their perceived level of intelligence or disability. However, everyone is capable of doing amazing things. Get to know people so that you can offer them opportunities to show what they know, in a way that is effective for them. Improving the lives of all people who need AAC starts with making sure everyone has access to effective communication. We also need to make sure students with communication disabilities are meaningfully included within their school environments. We need to refocus our efforts on being kind, and that doesn't require any spoken words. It should not take me or anyone else trying to convince someone, for them to understand that communication is a right. Communication is what we do as humans.
Communication is a right. And you saw her behaviors were so misunderstood. You know, she was so frustrated because no one was hearing her. So she said, I would bite and I would spit and I would run, and then she would get restrained. And sometimes these behaviors are symptoms of PTSD, and sometimes behaviors are all people have to protect themselves because we haven't helped them to get language. Presume competence, as she said. I want to add presume intelligence, presume maturity. One thing I'm totally against that I did, all these mistakes I made through these years, we would assess people for their mental age equivalent, right? Oh, they've really got the mental age of a 2-year-old, of a 4-year-old. No, there's so much intelligence. People can't always express it. People know, people understand, kids know, kids hear. Often they hear as we talk about them in front of them, right? So we have to presume that they are intelligent, they are competent. There's so much there. There's so much there. So, you know, the symptoms of PTSD, let me just go briefly over that. Re-experiencing, people get caught up in a loop of you know, just reliving their trauma. And trying to avoid it, right? Avoidance is a big thing. Trying to run away, trying to not get hurt because they're thinking bad things might happen again that have happened before. And we see obsession. I see that a lot with folks performing rituals who have autism. Like, these rituals will make me feel safe when they're threatened. Negative alteration in cognition and mood. Oftentimes that translates into a sense of hopelessness, a sense of shame. Sometimes when you ask a child with a disability, how are you doing? What's going on? They're like, I was good today. I was bad yesterday. And can't tell you or report on their internal state because they're just looking at themselves as a behavior. And arousal, which we see so much of, that hyper aroused state where they're triggered and they're running or they're fighting. And the main thing we can do, rather than shame them for that or punish them or take things away, is to support, to nurture, to help that person feel safe. And that's what's most important. We see trauma with families, right? So much trauma on so many levels, and intergenerational trauma that I think we've all seen on some level or another. What do we need for post-traumatic recovery and that post-traumatic growth? 3 things, and this is so critical. People need, children need, all humans need to perceive themselves as safe. If you've had trauma, that's your number one concern. Am I going to be safe? I bet many of you have worked with children who had a not so great foster care placement. And it takes forever to win that trust, to help them to feel like they're going to be okay. And that's what our focus has to be, right? You're safe with me. We're safe in this environment. We are emotionally safe. You're getting support, because when they've had any kind of trauma in those settings, then all defenses are up. So once folks feel safe, then the real person, the real kid can come out and start to grow. Otherwise, when they're so shut down and so self-protective, it's hard to grow, it's hard to learn, it's hard to advance in any way. So to have that post-traumatic growth, these children need to see that they're safe, to hear that they're safe, to hear that they're cared about, to be connected with, right? Connections are so important. They need that relationship. They need the connection to the caregivers as well as friends. Friends are really important. I think loneliness is one of our biggest problems in our field, that we have so many people with disabilities who are so isolated and so alone. And they need to have friends, have connections, have relationships that they can grow up with, not just be isolated. And it's so tough when you see these children who are isolated through school and no friends. And we've got to figure that out, right? How can we find that? And choice is a lot about personal thinking and personal approach. And that's critical, that a child really has real choices. I can't tell you how many transitioning youth I work with that would come to us and not know how to make a choice. Would say, what would you like? Even what would you like for lunch? Or what am I supposed to have? What do you have? What are the two choices? Because they had maybe some forced choice techniques. Okay, well, what are the choices? No, what are you thinking you would like? And that's just too much for them because they never had that and they weren't listened to. They didn't even know what they wanted in so many cases, right? So that listening is so critical. That's something that actually hits all of these. When folks are listened to, when kids are listened to, they feel safe, they form a connection, and they are empowered because they have a voice that's heard. Just exactly as Jordan Zimmerman is saying to us, please listen, please. Okay. And here's my listening slide that I do everywhere. That means that there has to be time when they're not getting advice, instruction, or ashamed. I know you guys don't do that. And we have to support people in having a positive identity, a positive sense of self. You know, it's so critical, so important that folks start to see themselves, especially at the critical point of development in adolescence. They're being given the message of what you're not. Oh, I'm sorry, you're not going to drive. You're not going to college. You're not getting that good job. You're not. And that's right at the critical developmental period, since when I supposed to be forming. And research shows us that a solid identity is the most important factor in having a successful adulthood. But it's never too late. When we are working with children with disabilities in foster care settings, the more we can develop a positive sense of self, the more we can help them to see themselves positively, to experience things that they can do well, to have friends, to know their preferences, to see where they make a difference. Right? Jordan Zimmerman said everybody has a purpose and everybody needs to be able to enjoy and experience having a purpose, having a role, and being proud of something, right? So important. And our words are powerful. We can hold up two mirrors. We can show what's totally wrong with you. Oh, you hit the cat. You did this again. You better not do this. We can hold up a mirror that says, you're trying so hard. You're doing so well. And that facilitates the post-traumatic growth. I see you. You're trying. You're great. You care. You're moving forward. Wow, you made so much progress. All those positive words have such an effect. The resiliency studies were done years ago, and they showed that, they looked at children who went throughout life with lots of hardship, lots of severe trauma, and some maybe didn't do well. They looked at the group that were able to actually accomplish a lot and move forward and have great growth. And they looked at the difference. And every single person, as they interviewed many thousands of people, thousands, um, those who were successful, every single one of them said, there was someone in my life who believed in me. There's someone who said, for instance, oh, you could be a great artist, or wow, you should go to school. You really can do things, or, you care so much about animals. You should be with animals. Whatever it was, they all said there was someone in their life who believed in them, who held that mirror up and showed them their own potential. Oftentimes that person wasn't in their life forever, wasn't in there. Maybe it was 1 or 2 years. Maybe they talked about the counselors from the Boys and Girls Clubs, or a guidance counselor, or a teacher, or an aide, or somebody else's parent, or a foster care parent. And it wasn't their parents. but it was someone saying, wow, I believe in you. I see you. I see you. And that's what every human being deserves. Every human being deserves to be seen, right? Here's a beautiful quote from Daisaku Ikeda. Every life is as valuable as the universe. And many of these kids have been given, the message like, you're not as valuable. You don't count. You're not the one. You're our other kid, or you're someone that's not really wanted, or you're someone that's not included. Every life is as valuable as the universe, and that's so critical. What do people want? There's a wonderful video. I love showing these. As I said, I love to have the voices of people with disabilities to be able to express, and this is one of my favorite from World Down Syndrome Day. They're telling us that, no, this is not special needs. These are human needs. And here they go.
People with Down syndrome have special needs. Special needs? Really? It would be special if people with Down syndrome needed to eat dinosaur eggs. That would be special.
One dinosaur egg. Enjoy.
You were totally right about Whimsy.
If we need to wear a giant suit of armor, that would be special.
I got a condo in Manhattan. Baby girl, what's happening? So gonna get to clapping. Go pop a phone.
It would be special if we needed to be massaged by a cat. If we needed to be woken up by a celebrity.
Wakey, wakey, eggs and bakey.
Where are you?
You may know me from Scrubs or Office Space. Your darker flicks, The Rock, Platoon, Wall Street. Funny story, I played Ben.
Get out.
My bad.
That would be special. But what we really need is education, jobs, and opportunities, friends, and some love. Just like everybody else. Are these needs special?
As they say, better than anybody else. Everybody can grow. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. Thank you. I always leave so little. Sorry.
No, you're wonderful, Dr. Harvey. You always fill my cup. And I've been getting so much feedback from others about how you've really brightened their day and just sharing this information. And I can attest, Dr. Harvey's the same person on a webinar as she is in person. She's just phenomenal. So thank you so much for joining us today.